This month, we're taking on what I call MayFlower. Kind of a take on the whole pilgrim thing, but certainly a signature flower of spring is the daffodil. Right now, as I'm recording this, it's about mid-April in the Northeast, and daffodils are at their height, popping up everywhere. Some of the late blooming ones haven't come out yet, and the early blooming ones are starting to fade, so we're right in the middle of the season. Always a pretty harbinger of spring. So let's take a look at this particular pattern today. But before we do that, I wanted to show you a couple of kind of fun things. Less focus today on the different stitches, because if you've been following along since the start of the year, you've gotten some of that information. So I thought I'd give you a little look behind the scenes as how some of these patterns start out. This particular design, and this is kind of funny, I've kept this at a quilt show one year. I was sitting there and I was kind of bored, kind of a slow quilt show. And back in those days, I had just started doing ornaments. I was predominantly doing pillows. Today, I very rarely do pillows, only by special request because they take so long to do. But I also do have some kits for those, but that's a whole nother topic for another day. But I decided that I was going to try to branch out from just doing animals and do the 4 seasons. So this idea of doing seasonal designs goes back several years. So I was bored at that quilt show, and I came up with this idea for what I'd like to do as the design for spring. And I started sketching. So you can see kind of in the background here, I was sitting there with a pen, because that's all that I had, and sort of, sketching the flowers that I envisioned for spring. And I worked on it a little bit, and I never pursued doing this as an actual pillow, although I do really like this design with the 3 different flowers and the bow to it. So maybe someday I'll actually turn it into a pillow or a wall hanging design. But believe it or not, so this was sketched out of my brain without looking at any reference information. So that's always amazing to me, that doing that, I actually ended up, if you look at this is actually really, really close to the design that I used for this block. So from that original sketch, this is one of those rare times that it was pretty consistent from the idea to several years later, it actually turning into a design. This is actually the iris that's next month's block, and we'll be looking at that. That's June's block, so we'll have that video out in May. I have not done this tulip, but there's always time. So I just wanted to give you a little look behind the scenes of how designers sometimes work. So in my case, in a lot of cases, I do sketch by hand. Today, I also sketch on the computer. If you follow me on Facebook, you'll see a little ditty I did the end of 2020 talking about making a cow design ornament and how I took a picture and sat on paint and made a design that way. So thought it would be fun to see that, because I still had this picture. And now that I've pulled it back out, I really like this design. So maybe that's going to turn into something at some point in its future. The other thing I wanted to show you is keeping in the mode of seasonal things. So what I did originally, all of these blocks were put together into what I call the mini quilt that has one design for each month. That's available as blocks and also as the ornaments. I know many of you are doing the ornaments, but they actually started out being that quilt. And from that quilt design, mini quilt design, that quilt is 12 by 16. I took some of the blocks and I put them into these seasonal wall hangings. To do some of the seasons, I had to make some blocks specially for these, but this particular one, which I call my spring wall hanging, which unfortunately with the Zoom I'm on, you can't see it in its entirety. But again, if you're on Facebook or if you go to my website, you can see this in its entirety. But takes those 3 spring blocks and I think gives us a nice little door hanging. This actually is hanging on my own door for my bedroom. I enjoy it that much. So it's always nice when you have a design that you make that you love it enough that you keep it for yourself and actually hang it up at your house proudly. So yeah. So that was just a little bit of history. All right, so without further ado, let's have a look-see at this block. And just for this block, I want to focus on how we're going to lay out these pieces, because there's you know, a few little tricky things with them and how to overlay so that you get a good looking daffodil design. The other tricky thing with this is that I suppose if I could go back in time and do it over again, I would make this a little bit smaller than it is because it fills up a lot of the space here. So you need to perhaps move things around a little bit. So if you look at this, you've got 5 yellow petals that are kind of different. There's basically two of each of these kinds of designs and then one of that. And these and that are pretty similar. Then you've got the front of your kind of ruffly area in your stem. So how would you go about laying this thing out? So I do it, and again, the instructions tell you to start with your wide petals. So here's your wide petals, and I actually turn them so that you have the sort of consistent curve towards the front. And you're going to want to put that a little bit in front of center and kind of out towards the edge of the design, because this daffodil is going to fill up this entire kind of circle here. Then you're going to take your other petal. I take this one that goes on the bottom. The curve's going to go towards the back this time. And now I'm going to take my narrow petals and lay those in. And right now you're just guesstimating where you think they might go. They don't necessarily touch. You can see I got a little gap going on there. And then finally you take this one, and this is going to go on the top, but you really can't put that one in place until you try to put your front in place. So if we look at this, we're perhaps too close to the front of our circle, so we're going to move this around. And I have set this one so that it's not as close to the edge. I have them a little bit closer together than perhaps when I did the original sample for this, so that's probably a good thing. And then I'm going to take that final petal and I'm going to put it over the top. Actually, no, I'm going to put it underneath. Sorry. I'm not following my own directions. Isn't that terrible? So that's going to go right on top here. And now you kind of have to look and say, all right, do I seem centered? I had to do a lot of kind of moving around to get my petals in place. I think I'm fairly happy there. Now, you've kind of got to stick your stem in now. You can't put your stem down first because you don't know where it's going to end up. So you've got to tuck it underneath. And I put it between this front wide petal and the narrow petal on the bottom. And again, that's going to go really, really close to the edge. You may want to move your whole design up a little bit if that bothers you, or tuck this in more. Or else I just tend to end up sewing around where it is really close to the edge. All right, there we go. And the last thing I'm going to put on is this little trumpet edge. And you're going to be tempted to put it over here, and that's not actually where it goes. It seems like, oh, okay, that's going to be the end of it, but this is actually setting the other end of the cup of your daffodil. So it actually goes kind of in the middle here. You want to line it up so that you're at the back edge of where that trumpet comes out. So it defines that front of that ruffle, and it makes it kind of pop. So that's our layout for the pieces here. So now once you got them laid out, you're going to want to iron this in place. I've, of course, worked ahead for you here. So I have the block version. And I've already done a lot of the stitching on here. So let's have a look at this. You're going to blanket stitch in your gold floss around all of your petals. Completely around the one on the back because that's on top of the others, but the others, of course, you're only going to stitch the edges that are visible, that are on top of the other petals. And then you can blanket stitch the front of your trumpet as well using your gold floss this time instead of your yellow. Now, as for holding this front of the trumpet edge in place, you're going to want to back stitch this. I don't think you need to draw this one in personally, because you're just going to try to stay in the center of that little curving area and follow the contours. You can see I didn't do it perfectly, but I don't think you can tell from any distance away, really. And then you also want to do some lines to define the trumpet section of your daffodil, and those are backstitched as well. Now, if you remember back in March, I introduced the fabulous marking pen. If you'd like to, you could sketch those lines in. using your marking pen. This is that heat activated marking pen, and I found that it works really well on the felt. Reminder that the water soluble marking pens, I think, make a total mess on felt, because as soon as you wet it, it kind of diffuses into the felt, and it's really hard to get that color out. So this heat one I found to be a good deal. So if you want to sketch those in, you can do that before you sew them. The one in the middle is essentially a straight line in the center, and then you want a little arc to the other two. I stitched them freehand. If you feel like you can do that, no need to go get yourself a marking pen. I also, when I was finishing this, I would do blanket stitch around the back of the trumpet as well, in that gold thread. So after you did the front, you probably come around and do the back of that trumpet before you did all your back stitching work. Finally, with your green, you would end up doing some back stitch around that green stem to hold that into place. So once you get it laid out and ironed in place, it's not too complicated. Fair bit of sewing for one of these designs, but that's all right. Not too complicated on the sewing. And you end up with a really kind of pretty symbol of the spring season. All right, so that wraps us up for today. Next month, we will do the iris.